Okay, I think we can start. First of all, my name is Antonio Andreoni. I'm a professor here in the economics department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to SOAS for the 2023-24 Penrose Lectures. I see some people are still coming now, so I will just say a few words of introduction, and we will be having a treat tonight with Professor William Lazonick delivering these lectures. As many of you know, this is a series that the economics department and the School of Finance and Management here at SOAS have been promoting almost now for 10 years. When this has been starting, of course, in 2014, there was a big event here at SOAS to remember and honor Edith Penrose. And since then, there has been an effort to bring together a number of leading international scholars to honor the contribution of Edith's work and her legacy in SOAS in particular, and broadly in a number of disciplines that go from, of course, management, innovation studies, political economy, development studies. In fact, today, if I think about, probably was just in 1964 that a Journal of Development Studies was created, and among them, Edith Penrose was one of the main promoters of that initiative. Many of you know Edith Penrose was a professor here at SOAS, and in fact, she was one of the founders of the economics department, from which the Department of Development Studies and the School of Finance and Management later developed. So effectively, we are very much in the right place to have this kind of discussion and this kind of event. The lecture, as every year, is structured in 2 nights. Today, we are going to have the first Penrose lecture, and tomorrow, same time in the same place, we're going to have the second Penrose lecture. And we also have the pleasure, after the lecture, to welcome you all for a reception in the Senate building. So we will leave together at 7:15 towards the other building. Let me say a few words to introduce our speaker tonight. And it's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor William Lazonick and share with you some reflection on his outstanding career and contribution to economics, policy, and of course, public debates. Let me start emphasizing that most of Professor Lazonick's contribution are indeed truly Penrosian. If you look at them in terms of their focus, of course, the firm and the social condition of innovation, but also in terms of the methods, a strong, deeply analytical engagement and understanding with history, productive organization, context, and of course, institutions. And finally, a strong connection in terms of their unconventional style and their unparalleled relevance in policy debates of their time. As Edith's work, also Professor Lazonick's work has never shied away from a direct engagement with the most salient issue in the economy and broader society. Professor Lazonick's career in economics starts with a PhD in Harvard, where he studied the applicability of Karl Marx's theory of capitalist development to the British Industrial Revolution. And of course, this was the experience that informed the empirical basis for many of Marx's arguments. And this work will be foundational for one of his first seminal monography later in the 90s, in 1990, to be precise, in the book published by Harvard University Press, Competitive Advantage on the Shop Floor. In 1975, Professor Lazonick was hired as an assistant professor in the Harvard Economics Department, where later in 1980 became associate professor, and taught over several years economic development, economic history, history of economic analysis, all from perspectives that were, of course, very much Penrosian and very much not in line with the neoclassical mainstream that was, of course, consolidating, establishing there. For those who are curious about the debate at the moment in time, I would invite you to look at the Harvard Crimson, which is this university daily established in 1873 in Harvard, in which there is a report of how Professor Lazonick appointments came about, the role that students played in asking for the appointment of a lecturer that cared for social problems. And of course, this was also the time where the Harvard Committee was formed and review the economics curriculum. And several fights for pluralism, of course, in economics department in Harvard and beyond were fought since then. Well, we know how many of these fights ended. The neoclassical economics of Paul Samuelson and others and other priests of the doctrine became the mainstream in the US and beyond, but not everywhere. And this is due to people like Professor Lazonick and earlier Edith Penrose, who played an important role in building a different a narrative, a different way of approaching the economy and engaging with the real-world economic issues. As already mentioned, in 1962, Edith Penrose was in fact central to the foundation of the SOAS economics department that still today remains a well-recognized world-leading hub for pluralism and real-world economics. I'm sure Bill will talk about his intellectual engagement with Edith, so I will just say that, of course, at that moment in time in Harvard in the 80s, when Bill became an initial member of the Harvard Business School Business History Group with Alfred Chandler and other very distinguished scholars, that was a very fertile ground for the development of lots of future contribution of Professor Lazonick in this area. Professor Lazonick in 1985 was appointed to a tenured professorship at Barnard College, Columbia University, and remained there until 93. And during those years, he produced other two seminal books, in particular, the Cambridge University Press book in 1991, Business Organization and the Myth of the Market Economy. From 1993, Professor Lazonick moved to a regional public institution at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where he remained for the rest of his career and where he contributed alongside other scholars, as here Mike Best, to the development of a master in regional development. Over the last 3 decades, his research on the rising contradiction in US capitalism and globally, the rise of the new economy business model, led to a number of pioneering contributions, in particular in 2009, the book Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy, which was awarded in 2010 the Schumpeter Prize. Already in the early 2000s, Professor Lazonick also initiated a prolific research program on financialization, in particular focusing on the tensions between financialization and innovation in the US and beyond. And this work received worldwide recognition with his Harvard Business Review article in 2014, Profits Without Prosperity, which received the McKinsey Award. And of course, spurred a wide debate in the US, which is still an important debate around the degree of financialization of the productive sector. And some Democratic representatives like Elizabeth Warren have widely cited Professor Lazonick's work as foundational for the building of a new progressive type of agenda. Of course, at the core of his work on financialization stands his theory of innovative enterprise, a theory whose development over several decades has found a systematization in his very recent book in 2023, Investing in Innovation, Confronting Predatory Value Extraction in US Corporation, again published by Cambridge University Press, as well as a number of other volumes co-authored with several colleagues on specific industry, including pharma and ICT. Over the last 3 decades, Professor Lazonick has had countless affiliations across prestigious universities, including the Business School INSEAD, and we are particularly pleased that a few years back, he also became a professorial research associate here at SOAS Economics Department. In 2010, Professor Lazonick has also founded AIRnet, which has become an important network hub for research at the intersection of academia and industries. And many of colleagues here across the School of Finance and Management and Economics are pretty much involved and benefit from that institution. Of course, the story I've just been telling you probably already prepare you to the title, the provocative title that Bill has put forward for this lecture, his engagement with today in particular with the doctrine of Paul Samuelson in neoclassical theory, and now Edith Penrose, of course, challenge and really go to the core of the problems of this theory. So we are in a quite unique situation now. The work that Bill has been doing over the years has become more relevant than ever. And I think we are today in a unique position to discuss how here at SOAS, where Edith Penrose has put a foundational contribution, his work can continue and can, in a sense, produce a new legacy for the economics teaching and research here. So without further ado, I would like to invite Bill to join me here for the start of the first Penrose lecture.
Well, thank you, Antonio, and thanks to Christine Outen for helping to organize this. And it's great to be here. I was at the original, in fact, I think gave a keynote address at the original Penrose conference here that led to this series of lectures. So it's great to be back giving this lecture. Okay, now, first of all, I make two big claims in the title and subtitle. You'll see whether I deliver or not. I think I will, but you know, that's why I'm here. Now, the way I couch this in the two lecture title is one is Edith Penrose Embarrasses Paul Samuelson, and the second one, Edith Penrose Exposes Milton Friedman. These were the two big dudes of economics when I was studying in the late 60s, early 70s. They were ruling the roost. The liberal East Coast Samuelson and Chicago School Friedman. Now, having given the lectures those titles, I have to say that I don't think, and Angela Penrose is here, and Edith's offspring are here, and they probably would agree that she probably would not go out of her way to embarrass anybody or to expose anybody. And to some extent, that's a problem, as in this quote from her book, The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, where she basically says, you know, those people are tending their garden, looking at prices and output, and I'm interested in the growth of the firm. And I think that's wrong. I disagree with that view, and I think there's much more that could be made, way much more that we made out of the theory of the growth of the firm in terms of confronting the neoclassical paradigm. And so basically, when I say that Penrose embarrasses Samuelson, exposes Friedman, it's really me doing it for her. So that should be clear. Okay, it's also the fact that her mentor, Fritz Machlup, at Johns Hopkins University, who actually was behind the project that led to the book, the 1959 publication of The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, also ignored her, was a totally neoclassical economist, at least in terms of his view of what mattered in the world. And in his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1966, he had 31 pages of text, 48 bibliographic references, not a mention of Edith Penrose, Theory of the Growth of the Firm. And it's apparent why in this quote that I give here from Machlup's address, he didn't see organization theory as anything to do with economic theory. So he really, again, however, without mentioning the book, which if you look at the title of his address, Theories of the Firm, Marginalist, Behavioral, and Managerial, is quite astonishing, but he doesn't say, okay, Edith Penrose, Theory of the Growth of the Firm, was organizational theory, not economic theory. So there is a certain amount of ignoring of Edith Penrose in that time, and I think that is, there are a number of reasons for this, but one reason is that actually what she was arguing was too much of a confrontation with neoclassical economics, which was ruling then and still rules the way economists think now. Now, if we can imagine, however, and this is, I guess, where I'm coming in, trying to build on Penrose and building on Penrose with other people, some of whom are sitting in this room, particularly my friend Mike Best. The theory of the growth of the firm, if you're taking it seriously by economists, you have to take some other economists seriously, and in the case of the third person, a historian, Marx, who said to understand capitalism, you had to understand a theory of the production process to underpin a theory of market exchange. That is the central argument of Das Kapital, published in 1967, English translation 87. It's still relevant today. Economists start with a theory of exchange and never get to a theory of production. Okay. Joseph Schumpeter, who said that innovation is the fundamental phenomenon of economic development. That's in his 1911 book, Theory of Economic Development. And as I'll give the full quote later, said in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, published in 1942, that perfect competition has no title to be set up as an ideal model of a model of ideal efficiency. And then there was Alfred Chandler, a business historian who I had the good fortune of working with quite closely, particularly in the 1980s, who verified Penrose's theory of the growth of the firm in two books, Strategy and Structure, 1962, and The Visible Hand, and then another book, Scale and Scope, and other books after that. Scale and Scope was 1990. But he had already laid this out, and he was at Harvard Business School. His work got more attention, much more attention than Edith Penrose, but they really went together. Not only that, they actually were like ships in the night passing at Johns Hopkins University in the late 50s, early 60s. Edith left there when Alfred Chandler was there when he wrote Strategy and Structure. Okay. Now, what I've done is, for I guess a few decades now, is build something called the Theory of Innovative Enterprise, and I'm building on a classic, The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, which is a classic because it's a book that everybody cites but few have read, and that's obviously a problem. When properly understood, the theory of the growth of the firm exposes the absurdity of neoclassical economics, or what I call, really, it should be called the theory of the market economy, while providing indispensable insights to a theory of innovative enterprise. That is how companies grow through innovation. Okay, now the theory of the market economy argues, and I'll prove to you today that this is the argument that is made and taught in every single economics introductory course that's taught around the world to millions and millions of people. Now it's gone on for about 75 years, that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. It's obviously an absurd argument. I politely call it the neoclassical fallacy rather than the neoclassical absurdity, but that's what it is. Okay, and in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about how we can use Edith Penrose's work to embarrass Paul Samuelson, because in his textbook, Economics, he propounds this neoclassical fallacy. And reason I say embarrass in his case is because when he realizes it, he tries to conceal it. He was smart enough to understand at a certain point that he was making this argument that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. So you'll see how he does this. In tomorrow's lecture, I'll talk about Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, free market guy. And I'm going to talk about his, what I call an infamous article in the New York Times in 1970 that kicked off the maximizing shareholder value movement. And there I say that Penrose, or using Penrose, exposes Friedman, because Friedman, if you look at his writings, knew absolutely nothing about how a corporation operates and performs, yet gets this kind of bully pulpit in the New York Times, out of which the shareholder value movement arose. Okay, now fundamental to economic analysis is something we call Penrosian learning, that the firm grows through investments and productive capabilities, and that is not just machines, it's first and foremost people, that result in organizational learning. Well, of course, now we know that machines can learn, but they learn from people having learned, and but that was learning that was going on. And as Mike Best always talks about, and everything he writes about Edith Penrose, it's collective and cumulative. It can't be done, the learning all alone, it can't be done all at once. So it takes time, and it takes working with other people. And through organizational learning, Edith argued, the firm innovates in one product market and then possesses, her term, unused resources, basically employees who have engaged in learning, to innovate in related product markets. The result is what in Strategy and Structure, Alfred Chandler called the multivisional structure that came to characterize the US corporate economy in the 1950s, moving from one product into a related product, or even to a related product market. Now, labor is central to this. Edith doesn't talk so much about labor as labor. It's productive resources, but the labor is there. And in this, she differs from Marx, because Marx thought that the growth of the firm depended on profits that a capitalist extract from commoditized labor, intensifying work effort for a given wage. I mean, that's the classic notion of Marxian exploitation. Research that I did in the 1970s on the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the cotton textile industry, an industry that Marx thought he knew quite well and to some extent did, and quoted extensively in demonstrating the rise of and consolidation of capitalism in Britain in the first industrial revolution in the late 18th and early 19th century. In fact, labor was not reduced to a commodity. There was a lot of learning, even in the context of technological change, and employers had to share the gains of technological change with key groups of workers. And that's how, in fact, standards of living rose for those workers. That has how, by the end of the 19th century, to use Engels' term, British workers who were in skilled craft unions were called the aristocracy of labor. In Edith's case, she's talking about the 1950s, and you have large corporations, and she's really talking, I don't think she uses the term so much, like Seawright Mills used white-collar labor, but she's talking about people who have white-collar jobs. But in the companies she was talking about, there are also people who, in the US context, there was an attempt to say you're just commoditized labor, who companies still depended on to get the work out the door, and semi-skilled workers in particular, and they tended to be unionized and were able to share in the gains of these corporations and have quite secure employment. Now, Chandler, a business historian, his book Strategy and Structure talked about again how the multidivisional structure emerged between the 1920s and 1950s. Book Visible Hand went back in time and talked about the managerial revolution in American business. And really, this is what Edith Penrose was talking about. There is strangely not that much interaction between the two. We can talk about that more perhaps in discussion. But Chandler, once he got to Scale and Scope, the dynamics of industrial capitalism, I had a lot of interaction with him. We were always talking about organizational capabilities, and that became a much more important concept in his book on Scale and Scope. Earlier, it had been about economies of speed, getting high throughput, and the things I was doing, particularly in the book Competitive Advantage on the Shop Floor, had more to do with how unionized workers were able to get the cooperation to get those economies of scale on the shop floor. Okay, now here we come to the critique. Okay, this is pretty basic to economics, supply and demand. The minute someone draws an upward sloping supply curve, they do not understand capitalism. They do not understand growth. They do not understand the economy, and they're going to make every mistake imaginable henceforth. Okay. We get high standards of living by having downward sloping demand curves, by some firms growing large, getting economies of scale, and I'll talk about how that occurs. And when that happens, we have problems for the way that economists tend to look at the economy, because we don't have equilibrium. We have disequilibrium. We have change. And this is something that Schumpeter understood, that innovation creates this equilibrium, and a productive economy is constantly undergoing change. So equilibrium optimization, as economists use it in terms of constrained optimization, is the enemy of innovation, enemy of change, enemy of rising productivity. And that's what needs to be understood. Okay. Now, when you have the theory of the firm in constrained, and you'll see what I mean by that, by this upward sloping supply curve, costs becoming higher as you expand output, and that being the norm, you're going to have a firm that's impotent and a market that's omnipotent, in the allocation of resources. And that's the end that neoclassical economists are looking for, whether it's Samuelson or Friedman. The market is supposed to allocate resources. Firms are just supposed to be passive actors in that process. That is a huge problem in terms of the reality of capitalist development, for better or for worse, and sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Now, when you have a downward sloping supply curve, firms compete to differentiate themselves from one another. First, by making strategic investments in organizational learning to develop a higher quality product. So that first stage is very important. And that's not just investing or even primarily just investing in expensive capital equipment, it's investing in people who, in fact, often stay with the company, unused resources, they stay with the company and become, in effect, assets of the company, even if they're not shown up as assets on balance sheets, even if R&D is counted as a current expense, for example, because of basically you can't own people, so you can't put people on your balance sheet. That's the basic reason. But that, nevertheless, is the reason, and it's not just R&D, it's learning goes on throughout the organization, and why we have can get higher quality products. Now, if a firm can differentiate itself by getting a higher quality product, it can get a larger extent of the market than other firms. Has to maybe spend a lot of money convincing consumers or buyers that it's higher quality, and it gets economies of scale and can transform those high fixed costs or potential competitive advantage into low unit costs. So the innovating firm transforms technologies and markets, whereas the neoclassical firm, you'll see, takes markets and technologies given and optimizes subject to those constraints. Okay. Now, in the theory of innovative enterprise, because it's making profits by differentiating itself from other firms, those profits become critical source of growth. Edith Penrose really took this largely for granted in the theory of the growth of the firm, but it's the reason why they can make use of unused resources, keep people employed, and move into new products and new markets and grow through what Chandler called multidivisionalization. Okay. Now, here is the comparison, which on the left is the theory that's in all the textbooks, in this case, drawn out of equilibrium, that the profits have not yet competed away, compared to the way you would look at an innovative enterprise differentiating himself from a firm that's optimizing subject to given constraints. And you can see that the way I've drawn it, it's on the right-hand side at low levels of output. It's at a competitive disadvantage. Its costs are higher than the competitive firm of neoclassical theory. But if it can transform high fixed costs and low unit costs, it actually can outcompete that, let's call it the optimizing firm, and blow them out of the water, basically. Now, the core concepts in how that is done is what I call the social conditions of innovative enterprise. Strategic control, relationships that give decision makers power to allocate the firm's resources to confront uncertainty, which is a basic characteristic of the innovation process, to transform technology and access markets to generate innovative products. So if you want to have an innovative firm, you have to have people who are making those decisions who have the power to do it, and they have to have the knowledge to do it and the incentive to do it. Okay, now what do they have to do? They don't just come up with a new strategy and say, okay, that's going to differentiate me. They hire people and they get people integrated in collective and cumulative learning process to develop these higher quality products, and then to be able to get a larger extent of the market, and this is no easy task, while maintaining the high quality of products. So getting economies of scale while maintaining the quality of the product is actually part of the learning process itself. So I call that organizational integration and financial commitment. Because this takes place, this collective process over time, cumulatively, you have to sustain that process with finance that is committed to the process. And in an established firm, you do that primarily with using your profits as a foundation for growth. You might use some debt in addition to that, and you'll see that becomes very important. We'll talk about that particularly tomorrow when we talk about why maximizing shareholder value is such a damaging theory in practice of how you should run corporations in the economy. Now, there's a demand side to this. You have to sell the products. You don't have low unit costs to sell the products. And without going into it in any detail at all, because it would take too much time, but basically I'd say in advanced economies, often because of the role of the state in making a lot of investments, but because of corporate research labs as well, you basically find different niches in the market. First, high income price incentive market like the military, or then as you develop those technologies, you move to middle income price matters markets. Then you might, the product becomes a commodity. Actually, firms that are innovative will usually have exited from those products at that point in time and turn to something else, make use of their unused resources for other products. In developing economies, and again, I could give you lots and lots of examples of this, but I've studied Japan, Korea, China, it usually works in the other direction, from process innovation, often transferring technology from abroad and moving from price sensitive markets, low income markets, to the higher quality, less price or price insensitive markets. Okay, now this is all a process of value creation and value extraction. So you're creating value, and then certain parties in the economy have the power to extract some of that value. And in fact, when you can get this productivity growth, higher quality, lower cost products, that's productivity growth, lots of different stakeholders, as we might call them now, share in this. Employees, higher pay, better work conditions, more secure jobs, creditors holding bonds, for example, a debt, they're less concerned about the company going bankrupt. Shareholders, higher dividends, share prices, not inconsistent at all with other parties doing well in the economy. The government can get higher tax revenues. The firm has a stronger balance sheet. It's more solid, and consumers get their higher quality, lower cost products. Okay, but what really requires to understand this is using this framework to understand how, in fact, that works out in practice. What's the political economy of this process of sharing gains? But what is absolutely essential to this perspective, particularly once you have an economy, and I'll give you some numbers on this for the US economy, which has very large companies, is how that works out in the largest companies. Because when large companies start sharing out the gains of productivity, they grow large through innovation insofar as they're doing that, they have higher profits, they share, let's say, with workers. That's how you get higher standards of living. That's how you get sustainable rises in wages. That's how you get a middle class. If you have a short-term tightness of labor, shortage of labor, the employers will find ways around that through technological change, outsourcing, et cetera. But if you have a system where there's actually sharing of the gains, the productivity gains with employees, then you're going to get higher standards of living in the economy as a whole. It will pull up other smaller employers will have to pay higher wages, figure out how to get that productivity out of workers. Okay, so when this is done in a way that, let's say, many of us in this room might say, oh, that's looks good in terms of some fairness, some notion of people having a decent standard of living, widespread sharing of the prosperity, I started calling this reaching progressive value creation. Because you can have a lot of value creation with value extraction, even when there's innovation, where not everybody who should be getting a share is getting a share. It's a question of structure, it's a question of institutions, question of power relations. Okay, I contrast that with a term that I've been using for probably a good decade now, maybe longer, and is a title of a book that I wrote with Jiang-Sub Shun in 2020, Predatory Value Extraction, where certain parties, usually have financial interests, who can get hold of more value than they create, are really being predators in terms of how that value is extracted. Now, I say here that can happen actually through the government. The government may be, as many economists contend, engaged in predatory value extraction, undermining value creation. That's possible. Wages, unions may get wages that are outstrip the productivity contributions that the workers are making, may undermine value creation. That's possible. But what I focus on, because I think it is the problem, certainly in the US economy, but to a certain extent in Europe, insofar as there is rising inequality, which there is in virtually every country, it's because shareholders can engage in predatory value extraction through dividends, stock buybacks, undermining value creation. And so that's really a central question that motivates the work that I do. Now, again, here is some of the latest data that comes out of the U.S. Bureau of the Census. These are firms in the United States, the number of firms, their establishment, paid employees, annual payrolls. I put a little red box around 5,000 or more employees. There are 0.03% of all the firms in the U.S. economy, 17% of establishments, 11% of establishments, 36% of paid employees, that's business sector employees, which is about 82% of all employees, and 41% of annual payrolls. So there's 2,138 of those companies, almost 22,000 workers on average. So these are massive companies, even at that level, never mind the 20,000 plus. And the pay is about dividing the employees by the payrolls comes out to about $72,000 a year. Okay, and they tend to pay higher than the smaller. Now, this is not the way economists like to look, or at least neoclassical economists, most economists like to look at the economy. Those large firms are the problem. They're massive market imperfections. That's not the way an efficient economy is supposed to work. Now, one person who raised questions about this is Schumpeter in Capitalism, Social and Democracy, and he says basically that if we look at the growth of large firms, they're the engine of economic growth, particularly in vast economies. And though it looks like they have too much power, they're too restrictive, they keep other competitors out, they're driving the growth of the economy. And he says, in this respect, perfect competition is not only impossible, but inferior, and has no title to being set up as a model of ideal efficiency. Now, I'll come back to this because that is, I don't think any question, anybody who's trained in economics thinks of perfect competition of the model of ideal efficiency. That was in 1942. That's true now. Okay. If anybody disagrees with that, we can have a discussion. Okay. Now, a critical part of the reason why Schumpeter was able to say this, although he didn't have the benefit of reading the theory of the growth of the firm, was because the firm grows by investing in organizational learning. So that's how the economy gets more productive and then gets economies of scale because people get the benefits of that organizational learning through higher quality products at lower cost. And Schumpeter didn't go that far. It took Edith Penrose to take it that step further, to say, why is that the case? And at least my interpretation of Edith Penrose here. Okay, so this is what I said at the outset, I call the neoclassical fallacy, and it is a paper that's coming out in a special issue on Edith Penrose, edited by Christine Houghton, is the most unproductive firm. It's actually out online already, but I think it's coming out in print soon. The foundation of the most efficient economy. Penrosian learning confronts the neoclassical fallacy. So a lot of what I'm saying is here is in this paper. And this fallacy is what PhD economists have been teaching to students, millions and millions of students for 75 years. And that's because of this guy. Someone else might have done what this guy did, but he's the one who propounded the neoclassical fallacy. And I'll go through this. This will take up most of the rest of the time today. Explaining this. Okay, well, first of all, Samuelson, he was known for its grand neoclassical synthesis, integrating Keynesian economics with the neoclassical theory of the optimizing firm. His Foundations of Economic Analysis, 1947, was all about the wonderful tool of constrained optimization. Nothing empirical in there. I've not read all of Samuelson's collected papers, scientific papers, 388 of them, but someone who has said that there was only one empirical paper in there in 1944 predicting depression after World War II. It didn't happen, so he decided not to write any more empirical papers. They're all mathematical papers. This is his science. At the same time, he was a columnist for Newsweek, as was Milton Friedman, and Samuelson often could say things that were somewhat sensible of what was going on in the economy. Somewhat more sensible than some of his followers now. I won't name them, who write for major newspapers in the United States. He was a smart guy. Okay. Now, his economics and introductory analysis came out in 1948 and created the modern economics textbooks, revised by Samuelson 10 times quite extensively to 1980. And in the first through fifth editions of economics, he explained why the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. He explains it. See how he explains it. In the sixth edition, which came out actually the year that I took my first economics course, but at University of Toronto, using Samuelson's text, but I think I must use the fifth edition because somehow I remembered this thing about why the firm is unproductive. But basically, he decided to cut the explanation out of the text. So there is no explanation. Now let me go into this. Okay. As I say, that's when I took my first economics course. That's actually Dubrovnik in the background, not the University of Toronto. And I asked this question, which I think was a quite sensible question. I remember this going through my mind. Okay. Okay, so what do I mean by saying that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy? This is in Samuelson. Okay, it's in the fifth edition, and it goes different pages in the first to the fifth edition, pretty much the same. 524, it's buried way back in the book, on why the supply curve is based on increasing costs, upward sloping. And he says, after the overhead has been spread thin over many units, that is, there's some fixed costs usually attributed to capital equipment, it can no longer have much influence on average cost. Variable items become important, and as average variable cost begins to rise because of, here's an important one, limitations of plant space and management difficulties, average cost finally begins to turn up. Thus, the average cost curve is U-shaped, falling at first because of spreading the overhead and economies of mass production, but ultimately rising because of some kind of diminishing returns. Okay, so that's it, page 525, and he has a U-shaped cost curve, and he says that the cost curve, average cost curve is generally U-shaped. Okay, that's where he's staking his, his argument. Now, note that he betrays his bias for the unproductive firm when he writes average cost finally begins to turn up, because if it doesn't turn up quickly enough, you don't have the optimizing firm, you don't have marginal cost meter marginal revenue, you don't have his foundations of economic analysis in 1947. It's all out the window, okay? So he has to have it turn up. Okay, now, what is how does this happen? Okay, it's, basically you're spreading out fixed costs, number one. Average cost rises, and he's talking about labor becomes increasingly less productive as the firm augments its employment as a variable factor of production. The lower the level of output at which, now here's important, labor becomes so unproductive that average variable cost overwhelms average fixed costs, the smaller the firm relative to the size of the industry in which the firm competes. Okay, the lower the productivity of labor, the smaller the firm, and the more firms there are in the industry, the more perfect the competition. That's the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy. Perfect competition is the efficiency ideal. We'll take a look at this because the firm is a price taker. Firms can sell all they want at a given price because they're so small relative to the size of the industry without worrying about any price changes. Now, it's actually a pretty inconsequential issue, but that's the way they define perfect competition to this day. Okay, now, what was it saying in terms of labor? First, it was saying you might have something like a sweatshop, overcrowded work, limitations of plant space, people bump into each other. This is what I learned when I first studied theory of the firm. The Luddites smashing up machines, dissatisfied with work. You have this getting into more of the Penrosian era, a little before the Penrosian era, because you didn't have, when she wrote Theory of Growth Firm, computers at people's desks, but someone falling asleep at his deactivated worker at his desk, and this young woman making little airplanes in her office. These are the bottom two are Edith Penrose unused resources. You don't want to use those resources. They're not much use. They're not really engaging in organizational learning. But that is the neoclassical view of the good firm. The optimizing firm is low or no productivity workers. It's there in Samuelson. Limitations of plant space and management difficulties cause the cost curve to turn up, and the sooner it turns up for him, the better. And that's why he has to say finally turns up. And no. So when I started teaching some of this stuff, actually about 2010, I started return to teaching some introductory economics. I started trying to impart this to students. This is a sweatshop, and I showed them videos of sweatshops in Indonesia. That's what they're talking about. So I wrote an earlier article about this stuff called sweatshop economics. Workers crowd into each other, limitations of plant space, so they're less productive. This is what I actually learned in 1964, 65. And there are more workers, so the workers don't want to work, so that they don't work as hard, they shirk management difficulties. This is what Samuelson had in mind. Okay. Now, you won't find this explanation in modern textbooks. So this is Gregory Mankiw, Paul Krugman, right and left in economics, but they both have this in their textbooks. The U-shaped cost curve is normally what you see, and then they give examples. You can read the examples. They're absolutely absurd examples, even as numerical examples, about coffees and salsa, and just the numerical example is the explanation of the U-shaped cost curve. So they don't say management difficulties, limitations of plant space, and we'll see why. That's because in the 1964 edition, Samuelson took that phrase out of the book. It does not appear after that. So then it was just the law of diminishing returns, that the cost curve rises. And that, now why did he take it out? I think there was probably a PhD student working with him at MIT, revising the textbook, and said, Professor Samuelson, aren't you saying that the most unproductive firm is the foundation of the most efficient economy? And Samuelson probably went home and said, maybe his wife was an economist, maybe he talked to her, I don't know, maybe talked to Bob Solow at MIT, and he said, shit, he's probably right, so let's just take it out of there. If he had left it in, and someone like me had come along, I was a graduate student started in 1970 and had been able to understand this quickly enough, it took me a long time, you know, he would look pretty stupid, he wouldn't be embarrassed. So I hope he's not around now to be embarrassed, but I hope that he's embarrassed. Okay, because that's what he did. He concealed it. Okay, but most economists say, wait a minute, what about the monopoly? That's the proof that perfect competition is inferior. And that's counter to what Schumpeter was saying. Well, that's a totally illogical theory because it's based on comparing one firm in an industry with a downward sloping demand curve. Nothing else has changed other than the fact that it's not a price taker, not really a price maker, still taking demand as given. But it has a cost structure that is like the perfect competitor. So why would you be comparing a company that dominates an industry and assuming it has a cost structure that's like a perfect competitor? Okay, so it's a illogical theory. You have to say, how did that firm come to dominate the industry? And the way it came to dominate the industry, I showed this before, and I put Samuelson there and Edith Penrose over there. It's because it restructured the cost curve through development of higher quality product, getting economies of scale, and blowing the optimizing firm out of the water. Guess which one got the Nobel or Swedish Central Bank Prize in economics? You don't really, not even a question. Okay, so I'm getting right toward the end here. We're going to have discussion. But first, I want to just go over some of this 9 assumptions of perfect competition and of this notion of ideal efficiency and where the mindset of economists, because it's actually have to go through this. Each assumption is a little more absurd than the one before. The first is assume the growth of the firm is constrained because of overcrowding of the workplace and loss of control over labor effort, as more units of output are added as a variable cost as the firm seeks to expand output. Okay, if you want to assume that labor is a variable cost, then you know that's reasonable. And if you want to say, hey, that's a sweatshop end there, we don't want that. But that's not where it stops. The next step is to assume that the increase in average variable costs outweighs the decrease in average fixed costs, because the average causing the average total cost curve to turn up, you get the U-shaped cost curve and a rising marginal cost curve when you add them up for the industry. That's a supply curve. 3, assume that the so-called entrepreneur simply optimizes subject to these productivity or cost constraints. Okay, he does not make investments to deal with overcrowding and control loss. You just accept them. Number 4, assume that all firms do this. Everybody just accepts the markets and technology and optimizes up to those constraints, so that nobody does anything about it. There's no competition in terms of how you try to deal with those problems. They're fundamental problems of management. Okay. The fifth assumption is assume that the level of output at which rising average variable costs outweighs declining average fixed costs is so small relative to industry output. So the more unproductive the firm, the more firms you have given industry size, because the sooner that cost curve turns up, the smaller the firm, that the firm can sell its profit maximizing output without affecting the product price, which is the definition of perfect competition. And I have an emoji there snoring away saying, who cares? But that is a way that economists, so now we're really getting into the area of absurdity. Assume as the proof of perfect competition, as I just showed you, as the ideal efficiency and a monopolist maximizing profits at an output that is lower and a price that is higher than the industry output and price under perfect competition. But again, I asked if perfect competition is possible, how the monopolists become a monopolist, and the innovating firm actually produces at higher volume, and it can sell them and make a profit at a lower cost than the optimizing firm. So it's looking really at an unproductive firm. Sorry, I flipped ahead to two more assumptions here. Assume that from the logical monopoly model that a state of imperfect competition represents a deviation from imperfect competition. Number 8, assume that large-scale industrial enterprises of the type size that I showed you there are just massive imperfect competition. Then what use do you have for Penrose or Chandler or Lazonick or Best or anybody else who is talking about? And you're not even necessarily talking about firms of 5,000. You might be talking about firms of 100 people. How do you keep those going, and how can they be productive and innovative? And so then there's the 9 assumptions. Here's the all-important 9 assumptions. If you accept all this stuff, you assume that you're a well-trained economist. So it says, I'm an economist. To save time, just I got this off the website. Let's just assume that I'm never wrong. Okay, that's basically the economics in a nutshell. Okay, so to conclude here, in theory, according to the theory of innovative enterprise, a firm grows large, outcompetes perfect competitors by transforming the cost structure by, for example, investing in a more spacious plant to prevent overcrowding. That's a simple thing to do. Creating positive incentives employers to expend more work effort, or in a knowledge-intensive industry, launching R&D initiative that may yield a higher quality product. So you differentiate yourself by making investment. That's what businesses do. And by driving down aggregate fixed costs, which includes the cost of investing in a permanent labor force or labor force that you consider in Edith Penrose terms unused resources, that's part of getting economies of scale. Basically, as I showed, everybody can potentially gain. For the prosperity of the economy, that's a big plus. For neoclassical theory, that's a big minus. And finally, in practice, this is Samuelson's theory requires that the firm, to be the ideal of economic efficiency, remain small productive. It means that the market dominates in allocation of resources in the economy. This is fundamental to market fundamentalism, and it's fundamentally absurd. Okay. And if the economy is dominated by firms to which, to use Samuelson's own word in economics, large size breeds success and success breeds further success, then perfect competition, the ideal of efficiency, disappears. The strain optimization might not be the tool that you need in management practice for running the company, and there goes Samuelson's foundation of economic analysis. Now, to talk about talking nonsense, this is from the horse's mouth. And this is my last slide. Samuelson writes in the introduction to his textbook, Economics, the test of a theory's validity is its usefulness in illuminating observed reality. Agreed. On that test, the theory of the unproductive firm as the ideal of economic efficiency receives a failing grade. As Samuelson himself puts it in the concluding sentence of the introduction, says, quote, when a student says, that's all right in theory, but not in practice, he really means that's not all right in the relevant theory, or else he is talking nonsense. Okay, and I say thank you, Professor Samuelson, for propounding the theory of the most unproductive firm as a foundation of the most efficient economy. You were talking nonsense, and your students, broadly construed, have been repeating this drivel ever since. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think it was a true treat for many of us, not just here at SOAS, but economists in general. We've been dealing with these issues. We have a bit of 25 minutes or so for a Q&A discussion, and we will be having a drink immediately after. I think lots of the issues that you are raising are becoming more and more relevant when we are trying to understand big corporations, right? At a time where people are interested in AI, are interested in during the COVID pandemic on large corporation, how they were contributing or not to the scaling up and distribution of vaccine and so on. Clearly, these are all calls for a better engagement, understanding with the relevance of economic theories, and in particular, how Edith's contribution goes at the core of the fundamental neoclassical apparatus, right? So the impossibility of understanding expansions, growth, economies of scale and scope, and so on and so forth. So I think this is going to be an interesting moment to hear from people here in the audience. What is their take and questions and ideas around what Bill has offered us tonight? Anyone who would like to start? There are microphone on the true side. Yeah, there is already a question here.
Hello, I'm Mike Joffrey from Imperial College. Given that what you're saying, and this is with great respect to you, is so obvious, how come you are one of the very few people, you've been saying this for over 30 years, how come you are one of the very few people who actually understands just how flawed, polite word flawed, quite how much rubbish the neoclassical theory of the firm is? How does it, not only how does it perpetuate itself, but how come there's so few of you who have the sense to see reality as it is?
While people think about that, why don't go ahead? Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's a bit of a hard question to answer, at least in one sentence. And I think, okay, as far as I can tell, I'm the only one who's gone back to the economics textbook and found this particular flaw. And that's, but that's in part because it's not been in the economics textbook since 1964. And so nobody thought to look at. So actually, in terms of the very particulars, what I argued here, somehow when I took that first course in economics in 1964, 65, the University of Toronto, this stuck in my head that the firm is limited in its growth because it gets overcrowded and you can't supervise workers. Now, I don't know if the professor sort of dug that out of page 525 of the fifth edition, but and so for years, whenever I was teaching a course or talking about the neoclassical firm, I would make this argument. And then when I started teaching undergraduate economics again about 15 years ago, I had to, and there were people there who kind of were in taking my class, not really knowing who they were taking it from or what they were going to get. But I had to sort of say, well, without getting into, well, this is what you would learn from any other class, what was wrong with this? I just started saying, well, neoclassical economists, or what you would learn otherwise, is that the text, a sweatshop is the ideal. That's clearly not the ideal. We're going to learn about how firms actually can grow and be beneficial to this society, and that's what we're going to learn in this course. And we're going to also learn about how once firms grow and become beneficial to society, an ideology that can come about that is based in a theory of the firm as a sweatshop that can totally undermine that productivity, create huge inequality, and that's shareholder value ideology. So now on the first one, somehow that just stuck in my mind. So the exercise of going and getting the textbooks off of Amazon, and I made a rule that I wouldn't pay more than $25 for any of Samuelson's used textbooks, and I got all 10 of them. I didn't know what I was going to find there, but that's what I found, that it was there, and then he cut it out. If I had the time, or if there was some student who wants to do this and go, I think his papers are at Duke University, and see if there's something on the revision that can get more what went on there. So that's that particular detail. But given that this is taught everywhere, you know, either you say that my argument is wrong, or you say everybody tomorrow should stop teaching this crap in introductory economics. Okay, the second one is more substantive. In the mid-'80s, I was at Harvard Business School for 2 years as a research fellow. And I had already been an assistant professor, associate professor in Harvard Economics Department. And I was interacting through the Union for Radical Political Economics with people like Mike Best. Not everybody you interacted in what was called IRPI, you would get these ideas, but there's some of us who had these ideas. So again, it wasn't necessarily done all alone or all at once. But I was at this particular place working with Alfred Chandler. By this time, had a fair amount of confidence in what I was doing, and they hired this guy, which I'll talk about tomorrow, named Michael Jensen, who was the guru of maximizing shareholder value. And I knew immediately when that happened in 1985, and I was saying it to people, this is the beginning of the end, because this is a very powerful theory, and people at a place like Harvard Business School do not understand where this theory is coming from. And to this day, because I still live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'll meet old professors from Harvard Business School who were actually tenured there, made that appointment, and they'll say, how did that happen? And I said, well, you know, I told you that was going to happen at the time, because this was not merely a theory that was in the introductory textbook. This was applying that theory to the reality and saying all the profits belong to shareholders. Workers are meaningless. They can just be hired and fired. Any investment that a manager makes is likely to be wasteful because there is no theory of innovation or productivity. And so it was being in some ways in the right place, the right time with the right people that I had the opportunity to think about these things. And it still took me a hell of a long time to get to what I just presented you here now. I had some elements of this when I gave the keynote address in 2015, and that helped give me that to the Penrose conference here. And it helped doing that in terms of my thinking, but I then had to go look at a whole lot of other stuff. And the last thing is I've done a hell of a lot of studying of companies. And so I think I know a lot about how companies operate and perform without having the advantage of having actually worked in one of these companies, thank goodness, for any long period of time. I've been, you know, but I also have people who in nonprofit organization, the Academic Industry Research Network, people who have worked in business for a long time, and we just discuss these things and what's the relationship between theory and practice.
So it seems to me that, you know, this is not just about really, you know, lots of the arguments you presented are about how we understand microeconomics, understand theory and so on. But the link between how all these theories have implication in terms of a vision of the world and, you know, the link between neoclassical economics and a certain type of neoliberal paradigm that has allowed for a maximizing shareholder value ideology to spread at the same time. To lost track of the importance of organizations and the importance of understanding the economy from the organizational point of view. I think Herbert Simon in the 90s wrote a famous paper where he was questioning if we need an economics for the markets or for organizations.
Yeah.
And I think the second point is this problem around how to look also at history analytically, right? Yeah. And I think your lecture shows how interrogating history is not just a matter of telling a story, is actually having analytical categories that allows to unpack really what is the driver of this phenomenon. I think few questions are coming up. We have 3. Let's collect the 3 of those. Please, can you, Kino here?
Thank you, Bill. Really great lecture. I've got 2 questions. One, you kind of already answered just now, which is I wanted to know how you think your theory sort of has changed since you first encountered that issue. and whether you think it will develop further or you're sort of happy with it as it is now. And then the second question was, I wanted to know, how important do you think are external shocks to the demand curve, particularly with regards to their implications on firms' ability to retain strategic control, to have financial commitment, to sort of invest in this organizational learning, and if you think that's sort of an interesting thing to analyze. Thank you.
Let's pick up another. Let's just take another one.
Because we have already two there, and then so Bill can take a few together.
Hi, thanks for that talk. Yeah, so the example that you gave was primarily the multi-divisional U.S. corporation as sort of, you know, a major site of innovation. I was wondering if you could also bring in other kinds of organizations that I think are equally relevant for innovation, whether it's cartel organizations, employer organizations, consortia. I mean, there are different ways in which you can structure imperfect competition and this kind of organizational learning. And you know, would you also extend your insights to these kinds of structures as well?
Bill, would you like to address those two and a half?
Okay, so the first question is, I mean, and it's related to the second one, that we study all kinds of different ways in which, you know, you can get productivity of the economy. Tomorrow I raise a concept which I started using, which I won't talk that much about, what I call the investment triad, how household units, government agencies, and business corporations interacting. There are lots of ways in which business enterprises can be formed and not be consortia of units of strategic control, although the issue of strategic control is very important. In terms of the first question, however, you know, basically there's just a huge amount of stuff to be studied out there, and a lot of the work we do is driven by policy debates. I'll talk a little bit, or things that happen. So I'll show some of the examples tomorrow very briefly with a former student of mine, Erdem when the Boeing planes crashed in 2018, 2019, the 737 MAX. Erdem has done his PhD thesis on Airbus and Boeing, and I said, we got to write an article on this, and we put together an article that appeared and got fairly wide visibility on shareholder value and Boeing and as a contributor to the crashes. We've been talking recently, the CHIPS Act in the United States, we've been talking about that. We had a couple articles which I wrote with Matt Hopkins in the fall on, which I'll mention tomorrow too, about the UAW strike, the United Auto Workers, and how they were looking to try to get their pay based on what executives got paid, and also the problem of General Motors in the transition to EV transition, electric vehicle transition in a context of financialization. So, I'd say in any, like right now, I don't know necessarily. There will be a base of knowledge I have and people I work with, but I don't know necessarily what the article will be that will write when something happens. So being in a position to do that actually is very nice. You know, but it also requires the Institute for New Economic Thinking has provided a lot of the funding that has allowed us to do that, and so that's useful. Now, in terms of demand shocks, or something that the firm has been doing everything right, and now there's a big problem. How do you deal with it? For some firms, that will be an opportunity. For some firms, they'll just succumb to it. But in some cases, however, the capabilities are so different that need to respond, and it might be more to a technological change rather than a market opportunity, that different types of firms will have to be formed. And this actually speaks to the second question as well. One of the things when we look at the pharma industry is that you have these large, big pharma companies, integrated manufacturers, and which there may be 15 that matter in the world. And then you have hundreds and hundreds of startups around where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, are all over the place. And actually a lot of the developing of the new science since the DNA revolution in the 1970s has come from these startups. And it's been very difficult for the large companies, particularly with the pace of technological change and the tools that can be used to actually be in the forefront of this. So what they do is they acquire some of these companies when they become larger. So, but you have, and often they take stakes in those companies when they're small. So there is a relationship between the two of them. And then they're all connected with universities and research that's going on in universities and the scientists in universities. So yeah, that whole structure needs to be looked at in the context of a specific industry. In that regard, let's say the information communication technology industry is similar, large firms, small firms, but not in terms of the dynamic between large firms and small firms. The small firms tend to grow and just push the large firms out. Also, they tended to build on the research done in the labs of the large firms, not in universities. So biopharma is different, but so the industries matter here.
And of course, we have seen even during the pandemic, that even highly innovative companies like BioNTech needed to find a large player who was able to manage this complex organizational scale operation. So there is a quite complex ecosystem there at place. There was a question there. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'd like to ask you about Tesla. So as the paradigm of an innovative firm today. So those who believe in Tesla and have been buying the company for very high valuations, they say that one of the reasons it's valued is on its organization. It's a very flat organization where the engineers have a lot of freedom to choose who they want to work with and in which projects and so on. So is this a very Lazonick view of seeing an innovative firm? And also, as opposed to this view, would Samuelson say that Tesla was just selling EVs when there was a demand for EVs in the world? Is this, correct me if I'm wrong? And if it's possible, I'd like you to expand on the Chinese EV industry. Are they, these new companies, BYD and so on, are they applying the Chinese government's pragmatic trial and error, decentralized way of innovating? So that's how they innovated in these industries, or do you see it in a completely different way? So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a big question. So, first of all, with one of the people who works with me just completed his PhD here at Hopkins. We're been studying Tesla and hopefully we'll have a paper out soon. Tesla is a highly innovative company. It fits the principles that I talked about, whatever you think about Elon Musk, and run by someone who had Musk. I mean, he was not the founder, but he came in with money. But he had the incentive and ability to run that company. I mean, and there's also SpaceX, which is a highly innovative company. And I think one of the things that he was able to do, Musk at SpaceX first and then at Tesla, is say, we're going to do something that is kind of impossible and get people to work for his company who just wanted that opportunity to do something that was almost impossible. And he got a lot out of those people. And, you know, by his own account, I mean, or the people like, you know, who've written biographies of, there's quite a few out there, you know, there's a lot of mistakes made and they learn from the mistakes. So actually, that is one of the things that seems to make sense to me as well. There is, within Tesla, becoming the first really first successful EV manufacturer, a lot of vertical integration, a lot of producing their own parts, a lot of attention to quality and detail. And what I showed you very briefly there, that demand side of moving from high income price insensitive to down the curve. That's exactly what Tesla did. So he started with the Roadster, high cost, and you know, people will pay a very high price for this. It'll be limited quantity. You won't get the economies of scale, but you'll get the learning. Then move to the middle income car, and then trying to move down low income car. Now, as they get this race to China, as they've gotten down toward the lower income car. The Chinese are out competing them, particularly BYD. And one of the reasons BYD is out competing them is because they're even more integrated than Tesla. They started out as a battery manufacturer and they own their own batteries, and this is a big advantage. There's also, and I refer you to a paper I've done with Ian Lee that's on the AIRnet website, China's Development Path. There's a whole strategy of development in China of the government investing in infrastructure, but allowing competition where you need to transfer technology, where technology is changing very quickly. And that included the automobile industry. And in the automobile industry, however, and the strategy, which was first put in place to try to transfer technology from abroad, which is called trading market for technology, that any foreign company had to have a joint venture with a Chinese state-owned company, usually at the municipal level. That has its limits. And for that, I refer you to a book by Kedong Feng on the exact title of industrial development, and came out in 2020. He's really the foremost student of this process. And his professor, Feng Liu, at Peking University, where Kedong is now, he got to know a guy who I worked with who died, unfortunately, at a young age, Qi Liu, who wrote a book, China's Leap into the Information Age, who was the first one to apply the theory of innovative enterprise to China. And we started talking about indigenous innovation. And in the early 2000, 2003, 2004, Feng Liu, who had been at Columbia University and now was at Tsinghua with his student Kedong, went to the Ministry of Science and Technology and said there are limits to the trading market for technology model because the foreign companies aren't sharing the technology with the Chinese companies. And they said, we need indigenous innovation. That became part of the medium and long-term plan, 2006 to 2020 of the Ministry of Science and Technology. That came from Qi Liu, my student, through those people. And it became actually, and at that point, they were able to do it because there was enough capability, however, coming out of those joint ventures that people were able to go and set up their independent companies, which was allowed after 1999. Now, Tesla was the first one that was allowed to be foreign owned in China without a partner. And that was a brilliant move because part of the deal was they had to buy their batteries from CATL, which, by the way, one of the reasons they got to be so powerful is because Apple outsourced all its batteries to China, a predecessor of CATL. Because it meant that there was a new competitor in China that you had to respond to. And BYD and other companies, at one point, Chery looked like it was going to be a leader, and not so much. Geely, which owns Volvo. But there's a lot of competitors out there, a huge number. And I think BYD's huge competitive advantage is that it has some of the most innovative batteries.
I think this is also raising, lots of lessons in terms of how people are now engaging with the debate around industrial policy, competition policy, and the mastering of competition or using competition to spur this kind of innovation dynamics, creating spaces for reduced competition and hyper competition in others.
Yeah.
You also mentioned, looking around, if there are other questions, this issue around more vertical integrated models and the advantage in terms of organizational integration. And of course, this is something I would be curious to hear from you. For many years in the GVC global value chain and outsourcing and offshoring type of mentality and model, which of course came out from the same neoliberal type of agenda, actually that model has been seen as outdated, as actually a very rigid model which was creating unnecessary, especially in developing countries, unnecessary burden in terms of industrialization and development. So how do you see this kind of things going? Because it seems now there is a recognition that actually, especially in a new kind of geopolitical context, that kind of verticalization and that kind of reintegration provides competitive advantage. In the case of Europe, this has been even articulated in terms of how do we regain strategic autonomy in order to not depend from a number of suppliers around the world. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, For a start, you can go and search on the book you mentioned, Sustainable Prosperity in the New Economy, ? Business Organization and High-Tech Employment in the United States. And it was based on the ICT industry. It's available for free on PDF on the Upjohn Institute website. There I talk about the old economy business model, the new economy business model. And actually, within that context, Chandler and Edith Penrose multi-divisional company becomes outdated. In fact, what it evolves into, and I had discussions with Chandler about this in the 1980s, that in many ways devolved into conglomerates and often unrelated diversification, often by outsiders coming in and taking over companies, but a company like GE, which studied a lot through internal growth, which was not coherent, which was just basically adding company on company, both before and after Jack Welch took over in 1981. And that was a model that did not work very well. The rise of venture capital institutions, the availability of technology, the availability of a global labor force meant that it's and a district like where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but many other places where you have, it's easier to set up because there are already people there that you can hire away. You can get the money from venture capital. You can have a lot more competition. And particularly when you have a wholly new technology, established companies are not very good in developing it. You can see this with the microelectronics revolution, for example. I mean, companies like Ford, Sylvania, GE, Hewlett Packard even tried to develop microprocessors. They were not, or at least integrated circuits. It was smaller companies that were able to do this. A company like Motorola was able to do it because it integrated that within in its consumer products very well. Intel actually tried to do forward integration in the 1970s and failed. So they could not integrate into selling computers. They tried to integrate into, I got an Apple Watch, into selling Apple Watches. Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, said he was wearing a watch was the most expensive watch ever produced in history because they were developing watches thinking they would have a better advantage with the chips in the watches. They did not. And of course, and that was also because there were more global competitors with different capabilities. And actually, one of the things in work I've done on comparing China and Japan, because a lot of their work coming off of Chandler's work was looking at how Japan perfected the old economy business model, the vertical integration, permanent employment, financial commitment. They lost out once you got into new economy business model where it was competing within the value chains globally. And China grew up with that model. So China has been able to move up those value chains. And China, its industry is much more intertwined, let's say, with US industry than Japan's is. I mean, Japan set up their own plants in the United States, their own supply chains, taught the US a whole lot about quality manufacturing, taught the world a whole lot about quality manufacturing. But for example, could not compete, even though they had in iMode, one of the most advanced technologies at the time, early 2000s, in terms of phone mobility, they could not compete in the mobility revolution. That came out of a new economy business model, and so it's changing now in terms of at certain points. However, strategically, there are things where you really the technologies that you're using you need to control, and if you don't control them, you're vulnerable. And though there is a question of whether you can do this on your own or not. Semiconductors are really interesting in that way because, Intel grew to be the largest in the world by being an integrated device manufacturer. Its competitor, AMD, which is now doing extremely well, tried to compete with Intel on that basis, but had to get rid of its fabs around 2008 because it just couldn't afford to invest in it. And it was not doing buybacks, wasn't doing any dividends. It could not afford to do it. Nevertheless, they've been able to bounce back in terms of the quality of their chips, the microprocessor and more advanced chips. And so now it's an extremely profitable company. A company like NVIDIA does not have its own fab. So it's clearly you can, as long as you have access to those fabs, you have, but then now we're looking at what some people call the chip wars, the TSMC being really in a hugely advantageous position in terms of being a foundry, global foundry. And that's largely because it got first Apple and then Huawei's chip business for the high-end processors. So there's a whole lot that's going on where you have to understand the industry and how it's evolving, and it's very geopolitical as well. Yeah.
If there is no other question, I think it's a great way. Angela, yes, please.
Just a quickie.
The microphone is just behind you.
Thank you. I'm not afraid to ask a really naive question because Edith always asks the most direct and basic questions. I do feel intuitively, I felt what you're expressing when I first read Samuelson in 1966. But my question is, at what point did it cease to be the dominant text in all introductory economics? Is it still dominant? If it isn't, I just don't know. If it isn't, do you feel more confident that what has succeeded it is any more rooted in empirical studies?
Well, I would say without having read all of them, but it's a selection of them because, and I gave had one slide there, which was from Gregory Mankiw, who's a professor at Harvard, Krugman, who, I don't know where he is now, but everybody's heard of him. And their textbooks, they're worse. I mean, they don't even give the explanation, and their textbooks are clones of Samuelson's. So that's, I think everybody would agree with that. And his textbook evolved. I mean, the 1948 edition would not be one that would sell today. I mean, it had actually more thought in it than what evolved over time, because over time they found out here's what's worked in terms of the paradigm, here's what's worked in terms of teaching. And so I would say they got dumbed down over time. Yeah, as dumb as the argument, what I call the neoclassical fallacy is, they got dumbed down over time, and in part because they're dealing with a dumb set of propositions. They're dealing with a total lack of reality. And one other thing, however, that I should say, because I don't think I really talk about this tomorrow either. There's an attractiveness to the argument. And the attractiveness is because we love markets. We love being able to choose where we work. We love being able to choose what we want to buy. We like being able to choose, you'd be able to get money if we wanted to start up a company, and that no one has, there are ways, and some people are disadvantaged, advantaged, but I do talk about this a little tomorrow, that markets are outcomes of having this highly productive economy. It's the organizations that drive it. And I will talk about that a bit tomorrow, but the other side of it is that it's very attractive to us to think that markets are what drives the economy, because that's what we experience as being outside that productive system. The other thing is, I think, the context, and I know this because I knew people like Kenneth Arrow and others at Harvard. Samuelson, I knew a little bit, but never really talked to him much. There was a generation that came out of the Great Depression and the rise of the Nazis and totalitarianism, World War II, who saw markets as freedom, and which would not exist in other countries. And there is a certain, what Milton Friedman will talk about tomorrow, called free to choose. There is something there, but it's what gets you in the position where you're free to choose. That is an important thing. And basically that's a kind of good segue what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, because it's not just the market there. It's having productive employment with an organization that can afford to pay you a decent wage over 40 years of your life and for 20 years of retirement. And how you get that is the question that anybody who wants to understand the advanced economies at least has to answer. And that's not answered in those, no way that's answered in those textbooks that people are learning from today.
Thanks. I think we need to, I look at Christine, I think we need to go to the reception soon. Otherwise we have problems, logistics. I think we'll have time tomorrow for further discussion. I think it's been an extremely engaging and truly Penrosian kind of evening tonight. We have talked about firms, theory, intellectual history, and the development of the discipline, and also how all these things are relevant to understand reality and the political economy of that. So I would like to invite you all to join me in a last round of applause for Bill, and invite you for the drinks immediately after. Thanks.